I think it's safe to assume that every Ninjago character that has an elemental power is quite clear and concise in what they can actually do with it. Of course, powers evolve, and I think that is the beauty of Ninjago, but the fact is that you can somewhat expect what you get when it comes to each of the elemental powers, apart from one. And that, of course, is the elemental power of Lloyd's, and I do believe it's quite confusing as to what it is and what it actually isn't. And to this day, a lot of people are very confused, and a lot of people actually disagree on what the elemental ability is. And that actually does include me, because I really do wish we had much more of a clear and concise nature on what Lloyd can do with his elemental ability. So I'm going to lay it all out in this video, tell you exactly what it can and cannot do, and then we will go from there and come up with a theory as to what his power is. And if you agree or disagree with me, let me know in the comments down below, because I would love to know what you think this power actually is, because honestly this is just my best guess. But let me not waste any more of your time, and let's talk about what the power actually is. Now, this elemental power goes by a lot of different names, but the most commonly accepted one, even though the writers don't really like this elemental power, it is actually called energy, but it does have multiple other names, such as green, green power, green energy, power, life, life energy. There is a whole lot of different variants on what the name of the power actually is. And fun fact, we do actually know that the writers aren't exactly content with giving Lloyd's power a name. Of course, energy is something that is used, and there's a reason why it's used, but the fact is that the writers have actually said that they don't like the name energy. So, as far as we're aware, there's not an actual official name to the power that Lloyd has. But like I said, energy is the most commonly accepted one because Lloyd has referred to his power as energy, and in a show where the power name itself very rarely gets used, the fact that in one instance he actually refers to it as energy, it is actually kind of a good thing to hear. So for sake of ease, I am going to refer to as energy from here onwards, but the fact is that it's not really called energy, and like I said, the writers don't really care for that name. But the fact is that it's an element that is derived from the source dragon of life, and it is considered a combination of the 4 elements of creation, being fire, ice, lightning, and earth. It is interesting though, because even though it is a combination of the 4 elements of creation, it does not actually consist of the power of creation in of itself, because that is actually golden power, and I think that is deserving of a different video in of itself. But the fact is that even though it does derive from those 4 elements of creation, it is not actually a combination of them. And you can mainly see that in the fact that it's green power and not golden. So the fact is that even though it does have that, it is not actually what it says. But it does then come to most commonly form a big green ball of light. Of course, there is different variations, and I will get into that in a moment. Of course, the most common second nature of it seems to be a flame, but the fact is that it does just seem to be what it actually says, which is an energy ball that is green. But what can that ball actually do? Well, the thing is that it seems to be able to do a lot, but at the same time, it doesn't seem to do too much at the exact same time. It really is confusing. Let me explain. Of course, in the standard sense, Lloyd is able to manipulate, generate the power, redirect it, and of course, use it in a multitude of different situations. And there's a lot of potential when it comes to the power, but nothing outright confirmed when it comes to it. Like, there's a theory that you could essentially heal yourself using the power, you could use it to shield yourself, for example. There's a lot of interesting instances where you should be able to use it in a different way. We also know that because it is derived from the 4 elements of creation, it seems to be that Lloyd is able to channel a specific power if he wanted to. You can mainly see that in Season 2 before he got his golden power, but the fact is he only uses it in this situation. But the fact is that the green power that we know he has was able to use fire, lightning, ice, and earth in that one specific situation. So it seems to be that Lloyd can do that, but he just doesn't really seem to do it often. And then in similar vein to the other ninjas, he can channel it into an elemental shield, which of course the ninja did use to survive space, which I do think is interesting that elemental power can do that. And then the given of summoning an elemental dragon, which we have not seen in a very long time, but the fact is that it can do that. So it does seem to have a lot of interesting different abilities, but the fact is that even though I've somewhat glossed over the manipulation aspect of it, the fact is that there's a lot of things it could potentially do that we don't outright know. The show has given us a lot of implication as to what it could do, but never really gives us outright confirmation, and I do think that is very interesting and almost by design. But interestingly, there are actually weaknesses to the elemental power of energy. For one, we know for a fact that it can be deflected depending on what you use, because we know for a fact that prismatic blades could deflect it, we know that the metal that Karloff has in his elemental power can deflect it, so there are counters to energy. We also do know that Lloyd can't use his powers underwater, because he outright says that during Seabound. So it's not exactly like the elemental power of energy is exactly infallible, it just seems to be that it has a lot of different abilities, and it's definitely one of the stronger ones that we have ever seen. But even though it can do all of these different things, the fact is that it seems to have a very interesting way of showing it, because as the show has gone along, we have seen the exact same elemental power to a lot of different things across the course of those episodes, and it is interesting to note the fluidity of what that power can actually do. But there does seem to be somewhat of an explanation for this, and that is, like I said, the fact that energy does derive from the 4 powers of creation does seem to translate in a lot of different ways to how the power is actually used. For example, with all the other ninja, it's quite consistent in what they have been able to do with their power over time. It is only Lloyd specifically that has actually had some sort of difference, but if you look at it in an interesting sense, you note that Lloyd's power does actually emulate the other ninjas' powers in some way. Lloyd's most common use of the energy power, which is that weird kinetic ball, is actually very similar to Cole, where that kinetic energy is very similar and gives a very real punch to the enemy that it's fired at. However, also like Kai, who has a tendency on burning things and burning through things, we've seen Lloyd on multiple instances also being able to do that, because like I said, we see green flames quite often. But then also, Jay's lightning has also been used because Lloyd powered up the mech in season 11 and channeled a green lightning, so the power seems to take on the other ninjas' elements in some way, shape or form. We don't have an example for Zane, but the implication is there. And I do think it's interesting to note that even when there's technically no golden power within Lloyd, he can still channel those other elements in that interesting sense, because it shows that it's very similar in vein to golden power, but it isn't. And I do think that's the biggest point above all. The fact that Lloyd's power does seem to have an emulation aspect to golden power, I do think is interesting to note, because we know he cannot channel golden power as he currently stands, or at least in his base form. So the fact that he can seemingly somewhat channel the powers of creation is definitely interesting. But that's the point. It's not elemental power of creation, it is not golden power. So what actually is Lloyd doing in this instance? Because even though he does seemingly have a connected link to the powers of creation, it's not. And the thing is, we also know that Lloyd may potentially have been the first master of energy, because even though Doc Wire stated we will have to wait on the answer to the question, it is seemingly implying that he may actually be the first one, because he has also stated that the first Spinjitzu master wasn't exactly the first master of energy. So if it wasn't done by lineage, where would have energy have come from? And I think that is the ultimate question. But I do believe I actually have an idea on what the answer to this question might actually be, and I do think I now understand why the writers don't like referring to Lloyd's power by any name specifically. And that's because I don't believe Lloyd's element is energy, or I don't think it is actually anything to do with power. I mean, the acronym of life you could see as lightning, ice, fire and earth. I think he's the master of life, but not because of his elemental power specifically. And that's because my theory is that Lloyd's elemental power is actually just the combination of the powers of creation: fire, ice, lightning and earth. I honestly believe that Lloyd's power is a weird meld of all of them that has come together to form this green energy. Of course, I do believe it is below golden power, but I do believe that Lloyd's power does have a weird seeming link between all of the 4 elements without any sort of outside influence, and taking into account that all the different powers seem to be within the power of this energy life, I do believe that they have to have some sort of involvement on what it actually is. So when we say that Lloyd's power is a mix of the main 4 elemental powers, I do truly believe that that is actually what it is verbatim. I don't think it's an aspect of the power, I think it truly is what the power actually states, and I do think the show actually tried to tell us this. In Season 8, when Cold accidentally takes the truth tea when he's trying to interrogate the Sons of Garmadon, the member of the Sons of Garmadon actually asks Cole what Lloyd's power is, and Cole's answer is it's a meld of all of the powers combined, and I do think it is quite literally what that states. I think by some sort of divine intervention, I'm not entirely certain, or something to do with the first Binjitsu master ended up getting a very small piece of each of the elemental powers within Lloyd. I don't think it takes away from the powers of the core four. I just truly believe Lloyd's elemental power isn't exactly original or more specifically unique. I think it's more or less a mix. And that is why he's able to channel them completely separately from any sort of outside influence. I don't think Lloyd necessarily has enough of each elemental power within him to be able to do what they are stating. I think in a genuine sense, the life or the green power that we see in Lloyd, it is literally just each of the elements coming together to be able to form something that Lloyd can actually use. And that is why it is just essentially a few steps below golden power. I don't think it is actually different from golden power in any way. I just think it's essentially weakened power that is formed in a very different sense. Because simply put, what else actually is there to Lloyd's elemental ability? If you look at it throughout the show like I did, you do notice that Lloyd's power doesn't actually do anything specific that we don't actually see another elemental ability do. And this is a concept that is completely unique to Lloyd himself. He is the only elemental master that seems to have an elemental ability that has nothing completely original to it. Even in Dragon's Rising, where we're introduced to subsequent and byproducts of power, for example fire and heat, you do note that even though they are similar elements in very way, wildfire is very different when it actually comes to Kai, and there is notable differences between the lot. Whereas, like I pointed out, Lloyd technically doesn't have anything that is completely unique to his own elemental skill set. Like I said, he either emulates or has something very similar to Cole, Kai, Zane, or Jay. There is actually nothing that you could honestly say is completely unique to Lloyd in this instance. And that is why I truly believe that Lloyd's power is not energy. I don't believe it is actually energy at all. I will continue to refer to it as energy because that is the most common consensus on what it truly is, but in my opinion, it is not energy. It is essentially life. Or more specifically, like I said, a combinational power, and it is something that is simply too weak to use on its own accord, and that is why we've only ever seen Lloyd channel those powers actually once. Because the other thing I would find interesting to note is that even though in the scene where we do see him use each power individually, he does use them, but notably weaker. Nothing ever actually matched up to his actual elemental power that we actually see in the green light. Of course, that is why he would use it in a typical sense, because it is the strongest variant, because it brings all of those elemental powers together. And that is why I think, in the literal sense, we should take the combination of the four powers at its face value. I don't think it's a combination to form something new. I think it's a combination that simply gives Lloyd something to use as an elemental ability. And that is why, at an overall, I believe Lloyd's power is essentially a combinational power. And I do think when we figure out what is going on with Lloyd's power, hopefully somewhere in the future, I do believe I may potentially be right with this fact. Because I believe that Lloyd's power is actually not as unique as you may realize. And like I said, and as I've shown, there is definitely evidence to suggest that. So if it's somehow the mesh of all the powers coming together, I don't know how it may have happened, but I do think that is how it went, and I do think the byproduct is what we all know and love. But what do you think of Lloyd's elemental power? Is this something that you may agree with? Is this something that you disagree with? Do you think there's anything that I've missed when it comes to Lloyd's power? Honestly, I'm very curious to know if you think I've missed anything in this instance, because if there's something else that may give me a different answer, I would love to actually see that. But as of now, I truly believe Lloyd is a combinational power of life of the four actual elements, and like I said, I think I've backed it up for the most part, but let me know if you disagree. But that is about it for today, you guys, and thank you very much for watching. Take care. Okay, bye!